Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
Hey, David, welcome back.
Well, thanks, Skye. It's great to be back. And is that a new background there with like stormtroopers and books? And
Yeah, the Holy Post now has an office in downtown Wheaton, and so some of my time I spend here, and these are my bookends. For those of you watching on YouTube, I have stormtrooper bookends that are holding my books up behind me. So Phil likes to refer to my home office as the Death Star, so I thought I needed some Star Wars reference in this office for when I'm here, and that's what that is. Anyway, I was saying welcome back, not just to the Holy Post, but welcome back to the United States, because you have spent some time on an interesting overseas expedition. You were in Ukraine. How long were you there?
I was in Ukraine for 5 days, and then it takes 2 days to get there and 2 days to get back. So I was gone for almost 10 days.
Yeah, I'm sure there aren't direct flights from Nashville to Kyiv these days.
No, it's a trek. So you fly from your home city, get to Warsaw, and then you take an overnight train from Poland to Kyiv. And so you cross over the border, and then you're a train, you board a train in a town called Helm in Poland, and you just go overnight into Kyiv, right into downtown Kyiv.
Okay, before we get into some of what you observed and what you learned, and you've written some pieces for the New York Times about that already, just the train brings up a question I've had. Like some weeks ago, President Biden was in Kyiv, kind of on a surprise visit. There have been other U.S. officials and other world leaders who've done a similar trip. And I always hear that they take this train, like you did, from Poland into Kyiv. Why aren't the Russians preventing that? Like, couldn't they easily bomb a railroad line? Like, that doesn't seem like something that would be difficult to... Is there any strategic reason why they wouldn't? Why is that access to Kyiv still to the point where you and others are able to get there? Why is that still available?
I mean, I can't speak for, I'm sure when Joe Biden is going, there's deconfliction going on. In other words, Russians, our president is going to be in Kyiv, hands off sort of messaging. But
why not prevent his access to it in the first place?
It is much easier said than done. So it's very hard to, if you hit a rail line, you can fix a rail line pretty quickly.
Okay.
So rail lines are difficult to put out of commission for any length of time. And then hitting a moving train, when trains are just going and going and going back and forth, that is deep into Ukrainian territory, is again very difficult, easier said than done, because there are air defenses scattered all across Ukraine. And so, the mechanics of it, it's just too dangerous for Russian aircraft to head that deep into Kyiv, into Ukraine, and then sort of loiter waiting for moving trains. So that's very difficult. And then if you're dealing with drones or other kinds of weapons, again, these are all detectable. So the air defenses in Ukraine, which are still, they don't blanket the whole country, but they're so much more formidable than they were at the start of the war. Ukraine still has an air force. It still has a few dozen MiG-29s, for example. So if you're just going to sort of fly over Ukraine and look for moving trains, that's a very, very dangerous and quite frankly, considering the risks, a wasteful thing to do. So
obviously the Russians haven't found that to be strategic enough to warrant the risk.
No.
You are a veteran. You spent time in Iraq. You've been in combat theaters before. Were you invited to Kyiv? Did you say, hey, can I please go there? Did you go to the New York Times, whoever makes those decisions, and go, you got to get me on the next train to Kyiv? Like, how did this happen?
Well, the Renew Democracy Initiative, which is a nonprofit founded by Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster and Russian dissident, was putting together a delegation, a combination of journalists and former diplomats and politicians. And they asked me to join the delegation. So I was there with a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and Bill Taylor, former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, Max Boot from the Washington Post, Corey Shockey from the American Enterprise Institute. I was there from the Times. So the best way to compare it would be to what Senator Heitkamp called a CODEL, a congressional delegation. In other words, it's like a delegation of people who go for fact-finding purposes. And so I was glad that times permitted me to go. And the fact that we are with such a sort of heavy hitting group meant that we got to meet with a lot of senior officials in a way different than if I just sort of show up in Kyiv and go, hey guys, like to meet with the defense minister.
Sure.
Right. So this allowed me to meet with key officials, from defense minister to foreign minister to U.S. ambassador to you name it, across sort of Ukrainian society and again, the senior American diplomats in Ukraine.
So in the past on French Fridays, we've talked a few times about U.S. support for Ukraine in this conflict, and some of the polling that shows support, American popular support for this intervention or support for Ukraine has waxed and waned a bit.
Yeah.
Particularly among conservatives and among Trump supporters, there is not strong support for this. As you've now been there and seen what's happening on the ground and engaged with both the political leaders, military leaders, and just the citizens of Ukraine, what's the headline you have for Americans who are disinterested or listening to this right now? What's your big takeaway?
Well, there's a cliche here that's sometimes used to describe the front line of this war, and it's called the front line of freedom. And that sounds cliched, and some people might roll their eyes. But really, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a aggressive war invasion launched by one of the most powerful authoritarian regimes in the world against a country that has problems, no question. What was moving towards liberal democracy. It was leaving the orbit of authoritarian Russia, and it was moving into the orbit of the liberal democratic. And again, when we talk liberal democracy, we're not talking about Democrats and Republicans. We're talking about the small L liberal structure of government, but moving towards the liberal democracies of the West. And not only is the war extraordinarily consequential, of course, in Ukraine. In other words, it's an existential threat to the very existence of the country. It's extremely consequential to the future of Europe and, by extension, the world. That if you allow Russia to expand itself through aggressive warfare, and remember, going back to World War I, the world has been trying to eradicate aggressive warfare. So, after World War I, you had like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which tried to outlaw aggressive warfare. You have the UN Charter, which tries to outlaw aggressive warfare. Aggressive warfare has been the mechanism of an immense amount of human suffering. Just immense. And when you talk about generalized wars in Europe, in other words, wars involving multiple countries in Europe, America always gets pulled into them. Whether it's the Napoleonic Wars, which the War of 1812 was ancillary to the Napoleonic Wars, to World War I, to World War II, it's just not proven the case that we just sort of say, well, whatever happens in Europe is for Europeans to deal with. That's never been the case. So the top line is we're trying to repel aggressive warfare. We're trying to secure the world, maintain security and stability in Europe, which, by the way, security and stability in Europe has meant a byproduct of that has been almost 80 years without great power conflict in the world. There are a lot of ways in which our lives are better in very material ways, and the ways in which the lives of hundreds of millions of people are better in very material ways because we've maintained this peace and stability, and it's now at stake.
So in 1991, I was a high school student, and Saddam Hussein decided to roll his tanks into a neighboring small country, Kuwait, and take over, unilaterally just take over. Right. And the world, led by President Bush at the time, decided this was absolutely unacceptable.
Right.
The first time since World War II that a country had just rolled their tanks in the way that Nazi Germany did, excuse me, to Poland and Czechoslovakia. I mean, this could not stand. The New World Order would not allow this to stand. And President Bush brought together a coalition, a massive coalition of global powers to push Iraq and Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Kuwait was too small to defend itself. It didn't have the resources to stand up against it. And there was overwhelming support for that effort. And we all have, for those of us who are old enough, memories of General Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell and these other, like, it was a defining moment for that generation. And it also, the last time America had been involved in a massive military effort was Vietnam, and that obviously didn't go well. And so this became an opportunity to learn from those mistakes. The country rallied behind it. We kicked out Saddam Hussein. We liberated Kuwait. Why is this so different? What's changed in America, do you think, that a massive power invading Ukraine, where we're not actually directly militarily involved, we're just giving aid to the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Why isn't there the kind of support we saw 30 years ago with Kuwait?
So at the risk of oversimplifying, let me boil it down to two reasons, one good, one bad.
Okay.
So the good reason is this massive power that invaded Ukraine happens to be one of the two largest nuclear powers in the world. And
so there's an intimidation that Russia's not someone we want to cross sabers with.
Right. Like we could deploy large numbers of conventional forces to Iraq and kick Iraq out of Kuwait without danger of nuclear escalation.
Right.
And so if you remember back to February 24th, 2022, when the initial attack happened, there was a lot of conversation in parts of the pro-Ukraine world where a lot of conversation that said, wait, should we implement a no-fly zone? Should we intervene in some concrete way? And a lot of people are saying, whoa, this is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq. This is Vladimir Putin's Russia. He has thousands, not dozens, not hundreds. He has thousands of nuclear weapons. He rattles the nuclear saber to try to deter intervention. And so throughout the entire conflict, all of our support for Ukraine has had in the back of our minds this calculus, which is, how much can we support Ukraine without triggering a dramatic Russian escalation? And so that was hovering through all of my conversations in Ukraine, was there would be a Ukrainian request for additional weapons. And then always through the whole war, there has been a question of, okay, if we give you this, does that increase the risk of Russian escalation? And so that's sort of the good reason why people have treated this differently, and it's necessary to treat it differently. We couldn't treat it like Saddam Hussein. But in my view, we've been excessively cautious about providing Ukraine with weapons because realistically, it is wildly implausible, not impossible, but wildly implausible that Putin would use nuclear weapons to prevent battlefield defeat in Ukraine as opposed to defeat in Russia, which is not on the table. Now, the bad reason is that over the course of the last 10, 15 years, a lot of folks on the right in America have grown, if not affectionate, sympathetic to a degree with Vladimir Putin, in a way they never were with Saddam Hussein. There was never a sense that, well, Saddam Hussein, for all his flaws, is fighting the woke West, right? But there has been this view, and you've seen it on the right, that essentially says, well, Vladimir Putin is a bulwark against the godless woke West. He has incorporated the Orthodox Church more closely, intertwined it more closely with the Russian state. He is against pronouns. He speaks against pronouns. He's enacted anti-LGBT legislation. He's an extreme example of what you might call Christian nationalism, that he very self-consciously views him as a bulwark against godlessness, or at least sells that vision, right? And so there was some pre-existing sympathy combined with this sort of contempt for the West. So before the war, and I think we've talked about this before, Skye, that people like Ted Cruz shared, here's a Russian recruiting commercial. Look how manly it is. And here's an American recruiting commercial. Look how wimpy it is. And, and then it turns out that the Russian military wasn't quite as fearsome. It's brutal, but wasn't quite as fearsome as the commercials would indicate.
So the argument you're making is essentially the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And since Vladimir Putin, for conservatives in America, also doesn't like these more progressive, culture changing ideas, then he's our ally, he's our friend. But I mean, if Mother Teresa, who did all kinds of wonderful things and helped the poor and the sick and the homeless and orphans, if she did all those wonderful things, but then unilaterally invaded a foreign country and resulted in the death of tens of thousands of people, I can still be against Mother Teresa, in that case. So, and Vladimir Putin is clearly no Mother Teresa. So even if you agreed with some of his policies, how does that justify not condemning his unilateral invasion of a sovereign country and causing countless deaths and humanitarian tragedies?
Well, here's how it works, Skye, because very few people will say, very few people, even on the more radical right, will say, I totally agree that Putin should have invaded Ukraine.
Of course.
What they'll say is, well, I don't agree with Putin's invasion, but, and as someone once told me, when there's a but in a sentence, you never pay attention to anything before the but.
Yeah.
It's everything after the but is the key. And so they'll say, well, but NATO provoked this. Or, but you have to see this from Russia's perspective. Or, but, and then there's an interesting level of investment in Ukrainian failure here. So these are also the people who will say, hey, look, Russia's really winning this war. Or they'll amplify the effect of Russian victory, such as Russia finally succeeded in taking this ruined city of Bakhmut according to most reports here in the last 2 to 3 days. And they'll say, see, look, the Western media is propagandizing you into believing that the war is going better than it is. And so the actual effect of it is they will minimize Ukrainian successes, maximize Russian successes. They will rationalize Putin's actions without explicitly justifying it. They'll leave I wish he hadn't done that. And you'll see things like maps of Europe where they show all the NATO bases, and then you'll have a map of the US and say, this is what it would look like if all of these bases were in Canada or in Mexico, and try to sort of drum up sympathy for the Russian point of view here, when the reality is Ukraine had zero capacity. The Ukrainian military had zero capacity to threaten Russian territory, to offer a threat of invasion to Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Ukrainian military had a smattering of Western equipment and a whole lot of old Soviet era equipment, and was much less capable, of offensive operations than the Russian military.
Right. So Ukraine was not a threat to Russia, clearly.
No.
Okay, before we return to your experience in Kyiv, which I want to get to, do you think if Putin's ultimate goal was to keep Ukraine either completely under Russian control or at least in the orbit of the East and Russia rather than NATO, did he make a strategic error? Because earlier, was it 2014, he took Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, and the West basically and NATO did nothing. And then there were more and more incursions of Russian troops and Ukrainians sympathetic to Russia in the eastern region of Ukraine, Donbass and other parts, that Russia was basically incorporating more and more into its territory. Would he have been more successful if he had just taken sort of the frog in the kettle approach of slowly absorbing more and more Ukrainian territory? And did he make a strategic error with this attack directly in the heart of Ukraine, trying to take the whole thing? Would the West have been more accepting if Russia had just slowly increased its dominance territorially?
So I think that what he saw was a window of opportunity closing, actually, not one opening. Because what he was seeing from his perspective is Ukraine was moving closer and closer to the West. Every passing day that Ukraine is intertwining itself more with the EU. Every passing day, its military was learning and evolving. Its military was getting more Western equipment, not the big ticket stuff like it has now, but the Javelin missiles, the lines in the Donbass, because remember, as you said, that Russia took Crimea and parts of the Donbass had been fixed for a long time. There wasn't much progress one way or the other there. So Putin's perception, I believe, was that time wasn't on his side. And then the giant strategic error that he made was believing whoever was telling him that this was going to be a walkover.
Sure.
That if you looked at the Russian attack, what you saw was a military it was not constructed to expect the kind of resistance that it got. And there's an interesting counterfactual that says, well, what if the Russian military knew from the get-go what kind of confrontation it would face and prepared for that, as opposed to preparing to just sort of road march into Kyiv with your dress uniform and your backpack, which a lot of these Russian soldiers had. I mean, they did some crazy stuff in the opening day or two, like sending some of their best airborne troops just straight to the airport outside of Kyiv. We didn't even do that in the Iraq War. We didn't send parts of the 101st Airborne straight to Baghdad Airport in the opening 24 hours. We wouldn't have left our troops that exposed, but that's what you do when you're arrogant. That's what you do when you assume you're going to win. And so his huge error wasn't necessarily, from his perspective, striking now in the sense that he probably accurately perceived time wasn't on his side. Mm-hmm. His big error was the way he struck.
Okay.
And the catastrophic losses to his military that just resulted from that.
So let's talk about what you experienced in Kyiv. When I think about the missile attacks that are happening there at night, the unknown, not knowing when your apartment building might be hit, it reminds me of the Blitz in World War II in London, and the resilience of the people of London and the way they dealt with that. Now, this is not exactly the same scale as what they experienced, but what did you see among the people of Kyiv who, every night are getting air raid warnings? And I think while you were there were some actual hypersonic missiles from Russia. What's the vibe on the ground among the people? How do they deal with that day after day?
Skye, it's the most surreal / inspiring / sobering thing I've ever seen. So let me go surreal, then inspiring, then sobering. So here's the surreal thing. Unlike London and the Blitz, because of the strength of the anti-aircraft defenses that have been provided Kyiv, Putin, even if he wanted to, couldn't create the kind of devastation over Kyiv that the Germans could over London.
Right.
His planes would be shot down. The missiles are mostly intercepted. But it's under constant attack, but it's also well protected. So it creates this dichotomy, which is you go during the day. If you're during the day in Kyiv, other than the fact that you'll see ruined buildings around from the earlier attacks before the air defenses were as good as they are, it's a normal city. Parents are taking you've got parents strolling their kids, you've got schools open, you've got restaurants open, you've got businesses, everything's bustling and normal. A friend of mine said, just call it Warsaw with air raids. And so you go and it feels normal, everything's fine, everyone's exhausted, but it feels normal up until right around midnight. And then usually between midnight and 3 a.m., there was going to be an air raid. And so the sirens go off across the whole length and breadth of the city. And people don't, like in the Blitz, then run to subway stations or whatever, because the nature of the attacks are different. It might be a dozen Iranian drones. It might be, as the opening night that I was there, 6 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, along with cruise missiles, along with drones, trying to overwhelm defenses from several layers. But the bottom line is, if you're a citizen of Kyiv, you have to make this decision. Okay, do I take steps to protect myself right now and interrupt my sleep, right? Take several hours where maybe I'm hiding in a bathtub or going to a subway station or whatever. Or do I just say, it's a big city. If my number's up, it's up. I need to sleep. And my feeling is most citizens of Kyiv are in the latter camp at this point. They're just like, you cannot live your life if every single night, and these things have gone on, really ramped up. So every single night I was there, we had a raid warning every night. 2 of the nights, they got the missiles got close enough to the downtown area where we were to see the air defense battle, light up the sky. And most people just say, okay, if it's my time, it's my time. But I got to sleep. I'm a parent. I have a job. And so you really have sort of seen a lot of people just kind of incorporate this into their daily lives. And every person sort of has their own rule of thumb of when do I seek shelter? If, I talked to one person who said, I don't seek shelter until I hear the anti-aircraft weapons, So it creates this sort of sense of exhaustion.
Some years ago, I read, I forget which book it was. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about the Blitz and the effect it had on Londoners. And the German assumption was we are just going to pummel and pummel and pummel London until it breaks the spirit and the resolve of the British people, and then we can invade and take over the country. And Gladwell points out that it actually had the opposite effect.
Yeah.
That as London was bombarded night after night, and yes, people died, lots of people died, but the ones who survived ended up strengthening their resolve rather than diminishing it. And there was this survivor instinct that, kind of like what you said, it's a big city, I'm going to take my chances, I'll probably get through this. Mm-hmm. And the more Londoners realized that they could survive this, the less likely they were to capitulate to the Germans. Is that a miscalculation that Putin is now making with Kyiv, that bombarding the city, even though it's not the same degree, is not going to weaken it? It's not going to change the resolve of the Ukrainians?
So I think two things are happening once. One thing where Putin thinks he can succeed, and another one where I think you're right. I think he is just trying to terrorize people. He's trying to create a world in which nobody who lives in Kyiv can sleep. And that's not the only city. There are other cities more vulnerable than Kyiv that are under air attack. So I think if he's thinking, well, I'm going to exhaust the Ukrainians, that's just not going to work. Yeah. Ukrainians are tired, but the level of resolve is off the charts. Their rage against the Russians is just off the charts. So this is not going to diminish Ukrainian resolve. But the thing that he might be able to accomplish is he is obviously trying to overwhelm the air defenses to make the Ukrainians shoot all the missiles they have, and to put a strain on Western allies to supply them with enough missiles. And so you sort of have this race, because Russia doesn't have an unlimited number of these missiles. Ukraine doesn't have an unlimited number of defenses. So who kind of runs out first is a big question, because if you run out of the Patriots, for example, Ukraine's more vulnerable to the hypersonic missiles. And those hypersonic missiles are no joke. I mean, that confrontation that first night was... I've never seen anything like it. The Patriot missiles going up in the sky, and the thundering sounds of when the shoot down in the sky. So an explosion in the sky is what you want to hear. An explosion on the ground is not what you want to hear. And there's a very big difference between the two. And so I kept hearing the explosions in the sky and felt a lot better, and did not hear that earthquake-ish rumble of the explosion on the ground. And so... right now, the Ukrainians are winning this battle. They're winning the air battle right over Kyiv. Russia is shooting drone after drone, cruise missile after cruise missile, now hypersonic after hypersonic, and they're just not getting through.
It seems like if it is a matter of who runs out of ammunition first, the Ukrainian ability to defend itself with things like Patriot missiles depends entirely on their Western allies, primarily the United States.
Yes.
And our willingness to keep supplying them with those defensive weapons, and possibly now giving them F-16 fighters as well for defensive purposes. But if the United States were to diminish or withdraw completely its defensive support of Ukraine, they're finished. How does that factor then into, and this will transition the end of this conversation, but how does that factor then into the upcoming presidential election? We're a few months away from that really kicking off. Donald Trump has said that he's kind of indifferent, if anything, supportive of Putin in this whole thing. And other Republican candidates have questioned the U.S. support of Ukraine. They've made it partisan, saying that Joe Biden is doing this for personal, even familial reasons, not really the interests of the United States. Is this election going to turn out in some way to be a referendum on U.S. support of Ukraine?
Perhaps. It's also, there's a lot of fighting between now and then. So we don't know what the conditions on the ground are going to be 1 year from now. There's a Ukrainian counteroffensive that basically the whole world is talking about.
Right.
And it looks like it's going to be pretty formidable. But one thing that struck me from the Ukrainian side was there was really two themes that I saw. One was, we're going to hit them as hard as we can. And the other one was, don't have too high hopes for this. In other words, we're going to hit them really hard, but don't sit here and think that this is our war-winning stroke and it's all over if we don't drive the Russians out with this. This is one offensive in a long war. So it really is the case that they're trying to prep their Western allies for a longer conflict, that don't sit here and expect that the next thing that we do is going to end the war. and you really get the sense that they realize that their position is their resolve is unquestionable. The support from the West,
right,
is that if you pair their resolve with Western weapons, Ukrainians feel like they can push every last Russian out of Ukraine. That's their mindset. If you don't have the Western weapons, they're still going to have the resolve, but their capabilities are going to be so much less.
Well, we know that Russia interfered in the U.S. election in 2016 through all kinds of online propaganda and manipulation of social media and other things. And we know they did that in 2020. And it feels like in 24, they have an added incentive to push America in a certain direction with its election, because a win for Donald Trump or another Republican candidate would likely reduce America's support for Ukraine. And you're right, we don't know what the conditions on the ground are going to be by then, but I'd be surprised if we don't see a real concerted effort on the Russians to push the West away from Ukraine through the manipulations that they've been so successful at in the past.
It's not subtle, Skye. So Putin just announced several hundred Americans who are, essentially being personally sanctioned. They're not going to be allowed in Russia, et cetera. And some of the people that Putin is personally sanctioning are just there because they're Donald Trump political enemies. So Putin has put on the list like Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia.
The guy who wouldn't find the so-called missing
right.
votes to give Trump the election. Right.
The guy who stood up to Trump to maintain the integrity of the presidential election in Georgia. So that's that kind of stuff. He put on there the list, the officer who shot Ashley Babbitt. This was the January 6th protester who tried to break through and to get to members of Congress and was shot trying to break through a window.
So these are all signals to Trump that, hey, I've got you. I'm your friend, so you support me. It's so transparent.
It's so freaking blatant. I mean, It's just unbelievable. And look, the Ukrainians are being pretty diplomatic about it all because they know that, hey, there might be a time not too long when they're having to deal with Trump again, right? So the Ukrainians are pretty diplomatic about it. I don't have to be diplomatic about it. The bottom line is, if you just go by what Trump said, what he says is he's going to try to force a peace on the situation, which would leave Russia holding big chunks of Ukraine. Like he says, I could fix this in 24 hours. A, he cannot fix this in 24 hours.
Right.
But B, the only way you fix it in 24 hours, unless Russia just agrees to retreat completely, which is not in the cards, is that you tell Ukraine, you got to agree to where Russia is right now or you're out of luck. And you try to force them to acquiesce to the extent of Russian gains so far. And so, yeah, it really is going to be if Trump gets the nomination, or if somebody gets the nomination who is reluctant to continue supporting Ukraine, really in important ways, it's not just who's going to be appointing judges will be up to the next president. It will be the literal existence of sort of peace and security in Europe, the viability of American alliances, the power of Russian aggression. I mean, this is going to be, I'm not somebody who says it's the most important election of my lifetime. Mm-hmm. That's only, obvious in hindsight more than foresight. It's going to be a consequential election, especially if Trump is.
It's probably the most consequential election in our lifetimes for the Ukrainians, and they don't even get a vote.
Sure. Yeah.
They don't get a vote in.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. Today's episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Magic Spoon. What's that? Let me explain. I got a box in the mail from a new company that wanted to sponsor the podcast. I opened it up and it was full of breakfast cereal. I like breakfast cereal, but the box said this cereal had 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs. It's high protein, no sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free. And I thought, oh no, this is going to taste like packing peanuts. So I poured myself a small bowl of the peanut butter flavor and gave it a try. And the next thing I said was, Lisa, you gotta come try this. And she said, wow, that's really good. But then our 6-year-old granddaughter, Marley, came over, so we had her test it. She tried all 4 flavors that come in the variety pack: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. And then she wanted to eat more. She liked them so much, she asked if she could take the whole box back to her house. Seriously, Magic Spoon cereal, only 140 calories a serving, and it tastes really good. You gotta check this out. So go to magicspoon.com/holypost to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, get your next delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/holypost and use the code HOLYPOST to save $5 off. And thank you to Magic Spoon for surprising me and for sponsoring this episode.
Okay, let's transition now to something completely different, as they would say in Monty Python. We are in the season of the year where the Supreme Court issues a lot of its rulings on big cases, and there's probably none bigger this year than the case involving a couple of universities and affirmative action. The Supreme Court's not given their ruling. It's probably not going to happen until June or early July. But I've been meaning to talk to you about this because it's such a huge case, and it may have implications that ripple through more than just higher ed. To begin with, just outline who are the parties in this case, and what, as shortly as you can, or as quickly as you can, like what's really at stake here.
Yeah. So this is brought by a group, Students for Fair Admission. Essentially what it's saying is different from other cases challenging affirmative action. Other cases challenging affirmative action in recent legal history tend to be brought by, said the claim is that what's happening is that you're discriminating often against white students. That white students are being intentionally targeted so that minority students, there can be more minority students.
Right.
This is not that. This has got an interesting twist on it because the argument here is that one group of minority students have been intentionally targeted to help other minority students, but also incidentally ends up helping white students a lot. And the targeting is of Asian students.
Right.
The argument is that what Harvard has done is if it applied its traditional admissions criteria, it would have a much higher percentage of Asian students. And the much higher percentage of Asian students means a lower percentage of every other race of student. So what Harvard has done is it has specifically and intentionally put the brakes on Asian admissions. And that it's done so in a number of ways, but one of the ways was by, for example, downgrading. If you look at how Harvard makes its admissions decisions, it goes through a holistic process that's like test scores and grades, and also like a personal rating, a personal score, like your personality, Skye, my personality. And the allegation is, substantially supported by evidence, that Harvard systematically downgraded Asian students' personal scores to limit their admissions. And so it was a very specific targeting. And as a result, people of every other race, including white students, now have more of an advantage getting to Harvard than Asian students. And that's sort of the basic fact pattern of the case.
And University of North Carolina is also a plaintiff in this that's being accused of similar discrimination against whites and Asian Americans as well. So this is not the first time affirmative action has been brought before the Supreme Court, but it has survived in the past. There was a case in 1978 that, what's it called? Bakke? Is that, how do you say that?
Bakke, I believe, yeah.
Okay. Explain what the debate was then and kind of where affirmative action rulings have been that has allowed it to stay in place? And what are the boundaries that currently exist on what universities can look at when deciding who to admit?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. So what the court has said over time is essentially this. The universities have not put forward affirmative action as a form of redress for past injustice. In other words, they don't say we're doing affirmative action because we discriminated against black students and we're making up for that.
It's not reparations.
It's not like a reparations. What they're saying is there are enormous societal and educational benefits to diversity. And so therefore, we are allowed as part of a holistic process to consider race as one of many factors with the aim of achieving diversity. Now, ordinarily, when you have a race-based classification, in other words, you're making decisions on the basis of race, that is almost always unlawful. It's subject to something called strict scrutiny. In other words, you're going to have to show a compelling governmental interest that you're achieving by least restrictive means. And rarely do governments pass that test. But the courts have said over time that the diversity objective is a compelling governmental interest. And then achieving it through these holistic measures is that's least restrictive means. It passes strict scrutiny.
So sorry to interrupt, but if based on that, if I'm understanding you correctly, if I were trying to defend Harvard's policy right now, Harvard would say, if we only look at applicants' test scores, grades, GPAs, things like that, a disproportionate number of our admitted students would be Asian Americans. And that would not ultimately create an educational environment that we think forms people in the way we want to form them. Therefore, we want to deliberately create a culture and an environment on our campus where there's greater diversity. And in order to get more African American, Latino American, other representation on campus, we have to look at more than just test scores.
Right. So essentially what they're saying is, look, if we did grades and test scores and extracurriculars and all of that stuff, we might have an entering class that is 30 to 35% Asian American, when Asian Americans are way less than 5% of the population. So therefore, our entering class is going to just be really skewed compared to sort of the national demographics, right? And so this is actually not the first time these universities have done something like this, because the other time was, of course, many of them intentionally discriminated against black students generations ago.
Right.
Many of them intentionally discriminated against Jewish students to prevent the Ivy Leagues from being, in their view, too Jewish, right? So there's been a history of universities sort of trying to get the racial composition of a class that they want. And sometimes it's been, well, the racial composition should not include, they might say, they were arguing the racial composition should not include black Americans, so they did invidious discrimination there. Or the racial composition shouldn't be too Jewish, and now it's the racial composition shouldn't be too Asian. And so it becomes honestly, Skye, a pretty nasty business. Because you start doing these kinds of racial classifications, and and some of the facts in the case are, kind of ugly.
So, okay, I'm assuming, I don't know how many students Harvard has or how many they enroll each year, but it's not that many. I mean, it's obviously far fewer than they get applicants for. So there's always going to be a greater demand than there is a supply.
Oh, for sure.
And I'm guessing that pretty much everybody who applies to a Harvard has excellent test scores and amazing GPA and has achieved academically excellence as a high school student. So if it's simply a matter objectively of hitting certain marks, they're still going to have too many people for the slots they have available. So there has to be some criteria by which, other than just scores, that they decide who to let in and who not to let in. So there's no objective way to do this. There's going to have to be some subjectivity in who they let in. But what it sounds like the courts are dealing with now is, can you allow race or ethnicity to be one of those criteria?
Yeah.
Is that the issue at hand? Okay.
Exactly. And so, and the reason for this is both constitutional and statutory. So the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees equal protection of the law. And so the argument is that if I'm not being treated the same because of my race, that's not equal protection. If I'm disadvantaged because of my race, that's not equal protection. Also, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits race discrimination in publicly funded education. And so the argument is, this is just, look, read the law. The law says no race discrimination. This is race discrimination. But the way the courts have traditionally interpreted Title VI is they say, well, this is basically the same as the 14th Amendment. And under the 14th Amendment, if you can pass strict scrutiny, we're going to allow certain kinds of racial classifications. And so the question then becomes, are there ways of achieving diversity without resorting to racial classifications? Because the racial classifications implicate the law in a way that, for example, saying discrimination on the basis of socioeconomic status does not.
Right. So in some of my reading, back in 2003, there was a case that the University of Michigan was involved in, and their admissions system had awarded points or deducted points based on an applicant's racial demographic. Yeah. And they ruled you can't do that because it's a violation of the things you just mentioned. So Michigan then started using proxies for race, things like geography and socioeconomic things. So if your goal is to get, for example, more students of color, well, we know geographically where students of color live, or we know that if you are from an urban location with a high rate of poverty, you're more likely to be a person of color than you are if you're from suburbia and this, that. So they had all these proxies for it. Isn't that just a rose by another name? Like, it's still, are we just playing with semantics here? And at the end, it's all going to come out the same?
It depends. So let's take, for example, what Texas did is it created a top 10% rule. So in the Texas top 10% rule is, if you're in the top 10% of a public high school in Texas, you can get into, is a UT Austin, you can get into either UT Austin or any number of UT system schools. And so if you, depending on where you are, if you're in the top 10%, and the reasoning for this was, wait a minute, okay, why are people from different frames of reference and different kinds of schools with different qualities? It's really hard to compare everyone people are coming from really rough public schools and doing as well as they possibly can within their context to people who are coming from posh public schools. And so there was a lot of reasons you could justify the top 10% rule for a lot of reasons that had nothing to do with race, but it also had the side effect of increasing diversity without targeting race. Okay. So the big key is the word targeting. All right. So obviously, if you're using race as a criteria, as a factor, well, you're targeting on the basis of race. I mean, you're just doing it like explicitly, like Harvard was. But then there's another situation where you might say, okay, we would really like more socioeconomic diversity, which is totally acceptable. Mm-hmm. The fact that increases racial diversity does not make it a racial classification. But if you did this, if you said, I really want to discriminate I want fewer Asians here. How can we have fewer Asians? Well, one way you can do it, we can either say fewer Asians, or we can say, we're going to, instead of getting everyone based on test scores, we're going to do everyone based on geography. But if the motivation is fewer Asians, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. So it gets complicated.
Yeah, legislating motives is really hard to do, isn't it?
It's easier than you think when the motives are announced. Okay.
Yeah,
so for example,
sure.
So for example, Disney and DeSantis, right? So this is something that happens all the time in cases. It's when I was practicing law, I would say 95% of the cases that I filed had what was called a retaliation claim in them. And a retaliation claim is a motive-based claim that says you are taking action You might say you're taking action against my client for one reason, but we really know it was for this other reason. And here's our evidence. So there was just a case decided in the Fourth Circuit about this magnet school in Virginia called Thomas Jefferson High School.
Right.
And at Thomas Jefferson High School, it used to be about 75% Asian. And the school board said, there's a ton of evidence that the school board said, we want to increase diversity. And so it implemented a new system that brought the percentage of Asians down to say 50% rather than 75%. And there's now a lawsuit, and the Fourth Circuit said in a divided opinion, that's okay. That in fact, trying to increase socioeconomic and geographic diversity has nothing to do with race. The race part of it was incidental. And the dissent goes, what are you talking about? This was targeted at race. And here's the evidence that it was. And it's likely to be decided by the Supreme Court. But all this sounds complicated, but it makes sense. So let's suppose, for example, you're coach of a cricket team, right? And every one of your players is Indian or Bangladeshi. So cricket's huge in the subcontinent, right?
Yep.
Not so much here. And you say, I don't want so many Indian cricket players. Instead of having a tryout based on merit, I'm going to have a tryout where I get one player, and this is an analogy that Sarah used, we just use on Advisory Opinions. I'm going to get one player from every block in the district. And so it's the best player from each block or each neighborhood. Well, then all of a sudden you go from, I don't know how big a cricket team is, 90% Indian or Bangladeshi or whatever, Pakistani, and to 15% or whatever.
And you have a really crappy cricket team.
And you have a crappy cricket team, but it's more diverse. And so if the goal was to get fewer people from the subcontinent, that is invidious discrimination. You can't cleanse it by saying, but the way we're really doing it is through geography. But if the goal was to just get more people into cricket across the district, and the side effect was a more diverse team, see how it gets... You definitely want to be able to do something about invidious discrimination, but at the same time, any one sort of admissions criteria is not the constitutional admissions criteria.
Okay, so the question I want to ask is, I think I know the answer to this, but can you give your best argument for why an intentional consideration of race should be part of the admissions process that does in a way that doesn't violate the Constitution? Is there any justification for what Harvard's current policies are that you can stand by? It makes, we may all agree that having a diverse campus is good for education.
Right.
But is there any constitutional case in your mind for intentionally considering race in admissions that can pass muster?
So, look, there's a couple here. One, there's some interesting debate as to whether or not the universities made a mistake decades ago when they rooted their rationale for including race in diversity as opposed to a reparations style approach. And so there were some interesting questions about, well, wait, would it violate the 14th Amendment if we said that this is a program, we're going to have a set-aside program from descendants of enslaved Americans? If you can identify that you're a descendant of an enslaved American, then we're going to have a specific program to boost your opportunity to be admitted. There's an interesting question. Is that even a racial classification? Slavery was a racial, in the United States of America, was absolutely racial.
Right.
Absolutely. But your status, to say the status is a descendant of a former enslaved person, that's not inherently racial.
Right. If I can pause you there, I'm thinking of if Barack Obama, when he was graduating from high school, was applying to Harvard, he could not have said, I'm the descendant of an enslaved person, even though he was African American. His father was African and not from an enslaved community in the United States. So there would be a case where his skin color was not the deciding factor, but his actual genealogy was the factor. Okay.
Yeah. And so there's some really interesting debate, and I do think that there is some merit to the idea that if they had made this argument from the beginning, they might have had a better chance of passing strict scrutiny. Well, would strict scrutiny even apply? Would the courts call that a racial classification? Then the other one is, okay, let's just sort of back up for a minute and say, you know that conversation, Skye, you and I just had about race-neutral programs that have a race disproportionate effect? They're like, come on, we know.
Exactly, that's my point.
And look, let's just cut to the chase and say, we know that what's happening is that these schools are trying to create a certain degree of diversity. And why are they trying to do that? Because it's really important for a diverse country to have its institutions of higher education contain all of the various strands of American civilization in the same entity, in the higher education world. And they're going to say, look, yeah, of course, we're doing some racial classifications, but it's not invidious. It's not irrational. It's not malicious. What it's designed to do is essentially try to make these universities more representative of the culture in which they inhabit.
Is there a case to be made for, in a weird way, increasing the deliberate consideration of diversity? Meaning, yeah, race is a factor that we're going to play, but do these schools have a point system or whatever, or seek diversity when it comes to religious diversity? Like, we want to make sure we have conservative Christians who are part of this, as well as progressive Christians, as well as Buddhists and Muslims or whatever, or socioeconomic diversity. Like, could you make a case that we should keep race as a factor here, but let's not highlight that as determinative, but we're going to make it one of 20 factors of diversity that we want on this campus?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because one of the problems that Harvard and UNC have is they're going diversity, 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 but in many ways they're not that diverse at all. So
right, it depends which way you slice it.
Yeah, so you might have a situation where Harvard and UNC, or Harvard in particular, has people from every race in the United States, people from every sort of sexual orientation, gender identity in the U.S., and they all think alike politically, right?
Right.
Well, that's not real diversity, is it? That's you've created a monoculture. You've created an ethnically diverse ideological monoculture. And so they have a lot of vulnerabilities, honestly, Skye, on this point, because they're sitting there saying diversity, 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 and the judges are saying, what about religious diversity? Oh, well, I mean, that's not the diversity why not? Like, is religious diversity not an important aspect of American experience? So the diversity argument as it plays out in real life is really turned into a bad argument for the universities, because the truth is they're not that diverse, Skye. Universities in America tend to be ideological monocultures. And so
part of that's a reflection of who their faculty is as well, though.
Right,
it's they're drawing a certain type of student. Okay, in our remaining minutes here, I know you're always reluctant to do this. Do you have a sense, based on the arguments you heard from the court and what the justices were asking, how this is going to land?
I would say I would fall out of my chair in shock if Harvard won. If Harvard wins the case, I fall out of my chair in shock. I would be slightly less shocked with UNC, only because they didn't have facts that were quite as rough as Harvard has. Harvard has some really rough facts. So there's sort of a spectrum of potential outcomes. One, which is, I think, possible but not likely, is, look, we're not going to say anything broadly about race-based classifications. We're just going to say Harvard did it wrong. Like, whatever, look, we're not going to overrule everything before, but there's just a lot of evidence that Harvard was intentionally, maliciously discriminating against Asian Americans, and that's out of bounds.
So what the implication then is the court would be saying to institutions all over the country, don't do what Harvard did, but we're not going to tell you what you should do either.
Right, exactly. Now, I think that's a possible, but not likely outcome. What I think of as probable is Harvard and UNC, you both lose. Title VI says no discrimination on the basis of race. That means no discrimination on the basis of race. 14th Amendment says equal protection. That means equal protection. No more use of race in admissions, period, end of discussion, I think is the likely outcome. And then the part B of all of that is, okay, if there's no more explicit consideration of race, to what extent can we do things like the Thomas Jefferson case or the 10% rule, where we do maybe socioeconomic diversity is the policy, but the hope and expectation is that it also carries with it racial diversity. What are you going to do? That will be the next phase. So that, I think, is most probable.
Okay, I keep saying this, but last question. If it goes the way that you expect it to go, are there implications of this ruling beyond universities? Are there other institutions? What does that look like?
So you're talking about things like minority set-aside programs, for example, in government contracting. You're talking about affirmative action programs in employment. These are things that are not although, of course, there's employment in universities. There's contracting universities, but they're not a university-specific issue. So what you would begin to see, I think, is an immediate rollback in response to this case of explicit race-based classifications. That's going to become extremely suspect legally. You're going to have a hard time justifying, if you're making a race-based classification in employment, in higher ed, in contracting, you name it, it's going to get really tough to justify it. And I think that's really important for people to note, because on the far left, race-based classifications are becoming kind of more popular.
Right.
So things like we're going to have a racial affinity group in this employer, or we're going to have mandatory orientations split and divided by race, or we're going to, those kinds of policies that are very, very, very race-specific. Post-Harvard, in my view, if it comes out the way I expect it to come out, good luck with that. Like, you're just not going to be able to do these sort of race-based set-asides any longer. They're going to be very difficult to maintain.
Wow. I mean, that raises a whole bunch of other questions for me that we don't have time to get into, but you'll be back again next month and we'll continue the conversation. David, thank you for your insights both on foreign affairs in Ukraine and domestic policy like affirmative action. A lot to process. So thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Skye.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jatani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.